Welcome to the Avoiding Plagiarism workshop. In this workshop we'll cover what plagiarism is, why some students plagiarize, how plagiarism is detected, why plagiarism is considered a very serious issue. I'll introduce you to Durham College's academic integrity policy and procedure for handling matters of academic dishonesty. Also, I'll talk about what does not need to be referenced, what you do need to reference, how to integrate research into your writing, the very basics of APA and MLA citation styles, and some resources to help you develop an action plan for avoiding plagiarism. So first of all, I'll start with what plagiarism is. Plagiarism is when you don't acknowledge where you got someone else's ideas or words from. So if you consider someone else's ideas or findings or thoughts as their intellectual property, much like you have physical property, so a car, a cell phone, a backpack, if someone were to take that property, that would be considered theft. If you take someone's intellectual property and don't acknowledge where you got that information from, that's a form of academic theft or academic dishonesty. So plagiarism is when you don't acknowledge where you got your someone else's words or ideas from, and you basically try to make it look as if they were your own thoughts or ideas. Plagiarism can be intentional or unintentional, and that can range from purchasing a paper or copying directly from an individual, or it could be unintentional where perhaps the particular citation style was not familiar to a student. Regardless, college students are responsible for understanding what plagiarism is and learning ways to avoid it, and hopefully by the end of this workshop you'll have a better understanding of how to do just that. So before we can go into how to avoid plagiarism, let's look at some of the reasons why students might plagiarize. One of the biggest reasons is that students save things to the last minute. When procrastination occurs, shortcuts are needed, and that's not a good strategy. A shortcut might involve trying to copy from another student, or buying a paper online, or even copying and pasting passages from a website. When students run out of time, they do things that they normally wouldn't do, and that would be plagiarizing. Another reason is that students may feel pressure, and it could be a time pressure, but it could also be a grade pressure, where students feel that pressure to do well on an assignment, and especially if they don't understand the material very well, they may plagiarize. They're in a panic situation, and they may plagiarize to try and get the work done on time. Another reason students may plagiarize is they're not keeping track of their information. They're not keeping track of where they're getting their information from. So for instance, they go to a website, they minimize it, open up another website, minimize that one. They're getting information, but they're not carefully recording where their information is coming from. And if they can't record where the information came from, then they actually shouldn't be using the information. So plagiarism can happen when students don't keep careful track of the sources that they're using. Also, plagiarism can happen when a student shares a file or document. This could be even computer code, it could be a lab report, it could be an essay. Sharing a file or document with another student, and then that student using that information in their own report. It is a form of academic dishonesty. It's a form of plagiarism, because each student really is being evaluated for their own work, and even if it's a group project, each person is to be contributing to the group project and doing some individual work. So it's very important that students understand what their responsibilities are and not share their work with other students unless the professor has given you permission to do so. Another reason that students may plagiarize is they may not understand the rules for referencing, and as I mentioned that before, if for instance it's a different citation style than you're used to, or you're not sure of the correct procedure for referencing, not understanding the rules is a reason why students may even unintentionally plagiarize. So how is plagiarism detected? Well, there's a couple of ways. One way is that each person has a unique or distinct writing voice, and it's a style of writing. Sometimes you write in a very business or professional manner. Other times you might your writing might be more sort of chatty or informal. Sometimes it's sounding very poetic. So each student's writing has a particular style. Within a document, what sometimes can happen is a professor will detect that one paragraph or one section of the document seems different than the rest of it. It doesn't seem to be fitting that particular student's normal style of writing. Another reason is that, or another way that plagiarism may be detected, is that your voice, your writer's voice, might be different from one assignment to another assignment. So, for instance, you did a report for your first report in the class, and then suddenly your second report just doesn't seem to match. It doesn't seem to correspond with or be similar in style to that initial report. So, plagiarism is detected oftentimes by a professor noticing that your voice is not the same as it usually is. Another way that plagiarism is detected is through the use of plagiarism detection software. Durham College has a license for Turnitin.com, and that is plagiarism detection software that uses pattern matching. I'll go into more detail in a minute. You want to make sure that you're clear on how and if your professor is using Turnitin.com. It will usually specify it in the course outline and or in a particular assignment guideline. The reason I'm saying that is there are different uses for Turnitin. For instance, it could be that you submit the assignment to this database and the database then scans for plagiarism and gives you a report. It could be that you submit your assignment to your professor and your professor submits it to Turnitin and scans it for plagiarism. So there are different ways Turnitin.com can be used, and if you have questions about how your professor is using it, you want to make sure to ask what the procedure is and get clarification on what sort of steps you need to take for using Turnitin.com. So the way Turnitin works is you submit your assignment, or your professor submits it electronically. It scans it, and the database scans it in 3 different ways, and it uses what's called pattern matching. So it's looking for matching text from your document to other documents that it has stored on the database. And Turnitin actually has millions of student papers that were previously submitted. It has millions of pages from journals and books and newspapers and so on, and it has billions of pages of current material that is stored on the internet, as well as archived pages, so pages that are no longer online. So this database is huge, and what happens is your paper is scanned. Initially it's compared to other student papers, then it is compared to the journals and books and newspapers, and finally it's compared to the internet. What ends up happening, and this takes like a matter of minutes, is your professor or you, depending on what the procedure was, will get back what's called an originality report. And that originality report will indicate the percentage of plagiarism from each source. So it will rank it. It will have, for instance, this particular source there was 7% plagiarism. This particular source there was 5% plagiarism. And alongside your document, your original document, which would appear on the left side of the screen, on the right side of the screen is the document that's linked to the sources that the material was taken from. So for instance, if you used material from a website and in your document you didn't use quotation marks or you didn't reference it, what would happen is that would come back as plagiarized, and it would give a link directly to that particular website, and your professor or you could confirm that, oh shoot, I didn't reference, or yes, plagiarism did indeed occur. So it all happens very quickly and it's very clear. Sometimes what happens though is that the referencing is not picked up by Turnitin.com, and then it's up to your professor to determine whether or not plagiarism actually did occur, or if it was sort of an oversight on the part of the database. It's a tool. It's not meant to be the only deciding factor, but it's a tool that allows you or your professor to look through a document to check to make sure you've referenced things correctly and to make sure that you've used material from a variety of sources and given credit where credit is due. Again, if you do have questions about how your professor is using Turnitin.com, you want to go and approach him or her so that you can get clarification. The Turnitin.com is not just used in Canada or North America for that matter. It's used in over 125 countries by thousands of post-secondary and high school institutions. So it's very widely used, and that accounts for why the database is so huge and growing every day for that matter. So why is plagiarism a serious issue? Well, I've sort of alluded to a few of these things already, but first of all, plagiarism is dishonest. It really is a form of stealing. If you're not giving credit to a particular source or author, then you have basically stolen their intellectual property. So it's dishonest. Another reason plagiarism is serious is that it negatively affects the reputation of the school. So all post-secondary institutions have policies around academic integrity and plagiarism. And if Durham College, for instance, didn't treat it seriously, if Durham College sort of turned a blind eye or didn't give consequences for plagiarism or allowed cheating to happen, then the reputation of the institution is lowered. By the time you graduate, your diploma or certificate wouldn't be as worth as much as if the college treated students' academic integrity as a very serious issue and making sure that students are doing their work in an open and honest way. So plagiarism can actually have a very negative effect on the institution and ultimately to the graduates. Also, plagiarism negatively affects the credibility of the writer. So you as a student as well as a future employee, you want to be seen as an honest, trustworthy person. If you are stealing information, not giving credit for where you got your information from, people will be less likely to believe you. Your credibility will suffer, and that's not a good thing for anybody. Finally, plagiarism prevents the writer from actually understanding the material. So when you plagiarize, you're taking the information, you're not giving credit, you're copying and pasting without any regard for where the information came from, and you're actually not understanding the material. So simply quoting material or taking huge chunks of information from other sources doesn't actually demonstrate that you understand the material. It really just shows that you can copy and paste. So plagiarism is serious because it actually prevents people from properly understanding the course content they're responsible for understanding. So when we look at Durham College's academic integrity policy, you'll see that academic integrity refers to pursuing scholarly activity in an open, honest, and responsible manner. And we want students to study in a way that's open, honest, and responsible, so that is ultimately preparing them for the workforce. One part of academic dishonesty is plagiarism, and the academic dishonesty definition also includes copying someone else's work, collaborating without permission. So for instance, if your professor has said to you, okay, I want you to work independently, then sharing information is considered collaborating without permission. If your professor has said, okay, this is a group project, you're all meant to share information, you're all meant to submit the same assignment, you're all going to present the same topic, and you're all going to receive the same mark, then you've been given permission. But if the instructions are otherwise, then you need to clarify whether or not you're allowed to collaborate, and if you're not allowed to collaborate and you do, that's considered academically dishonest. Another part of academic dishonesty, as I mentioned, is plagiarizing. And plagiarizing is when you don't acknowledge where you got your ideas from, data, so that is statistics, graphics such as images, or any other content without properly acknowledging where you got that information from. So I would encourage you to check out Durham College's policy on academic integrity. I'll just show you here. It outlines what academic dishonesty is, academic integrity. It mentions the responsibility of students and staff to maintain high standards of academic integrity. As I mentioned before, otherwise the institution's reputation is negatively affected. It outlines the roles and responsibilities of each person. So the policy is very clearly written, actually, and as I said, I would encourage students to take a look at it and make sure they're familiar with their responsibilities. So policies have procedures. If the policy is broken, then there are procedures for handling that situation. And as I mentioned, academic dishonesty, which includes plagiarism, is treated very seriously at the college. So if a student were to break academic integrity policy, then the consequences range from an academic alert being placed in the student's file, or receiving a 0 on the assignment, or being withdrawn from the course, or the program, or the college ultimately. So it's handled in a very serious way, and as I said, if students are familiar with the policy and the procedures and understand the content of this workshop, then hopefully they won't get themselves into trouble. So here's where the procedure is outlined, who's responsible for doing what, how quickly things need to be handled, and the penalties for breaking academic integrity policy. And so you can see the consequences on the first offense, the second offense, and a third offense. So now that you're familiar with what plagiarism is and why students might plagiarize and what the college policy is regarding plagiarism, I do want to go over some information you need to know about what does not need to be referenced. So when I mentioned that plagiarism is when you don't acknowledge where you got your information from, there are actually 2 times when you don't need to acknowledge where you got your information from. One of them is your opinion. So for instance, if you believe that a particular company should reduce its prices, or if you believe that students' tuition should be decreased, or if you believe that nurses should be accredited in a different manner, anything that's your opinion does not need to be referenced. How you support that opinion, however, does need to be referenced. So when you state your opinion on how you feel about a particular topic, or whether you think something is better than something else, your opinion, as I said, does not need to be referenced, but the statistics and definitions and studies that you use to support that opinion does need to be referenced. Another thing that does not need to be referenced is common knowledge. And this is sometimes a gray area for students. We consider common knowledge information that is generally known or accepted by educated people. So things such as well-proven historical facts and dates. Canada became a country on July 1st, 1867. Cows give milk. Babies cry. Those kinds of things that are really not disputable. If the information appears in the same form in 5 or more sources, generally that's considered common knowledge. So if you read it in a book, you see it on a website, you see it in a journal, then that might be considered common knowledge. But the reason I said it's a bit of a gray area is that sometimes information is widely known and accepted, but it is more sort of specialized knowledge. So you want to make sure that if you're not sure whether something is common knowledge, you want to go and consult a credible source and then reference the material. It's actually safer to do that than to not reference it. And if you're in doubt, it would be wise to talk with your professor and just get clarification. Would this be considered common knowledge? Should I reference this, or does it not need to be referenced? It's not wrong, really, ever to reference something that is, if you're using a credible source. So even a piece of information that seems to be kind of iffy whether it's common knowledge or not, it's not wrong. It's not going to hurt you to reference it. But if you're in doubt, get clarification from your professor. Now, there are really only 2 things, as I mentioned, your opinion and common knowledge, that doesn't need to be referenced. Pretty well everything else does. So whether you're writing an essay, a report, or doing a presentation, you must give credit where credit is due. You must cite the material that is not your idea. And there are 2 parts to referencing, and I'll go into a little bit more detail when I discuss APA and MLA. But basically you need to reference in the body of your paper or your presentation. That would be called an in-text citation, and that would go right in the body of your paper. As well, there's a page at the end of your paper called either references or works cited, depending on which citation style you're using, that would indicate the details for that source. Some people call it a bibliography, but as you'll see in the next couple of slides, they actually have different names depending on which citation style you're using. So 5 situations where material must be referenced. The first one is for direct quotations. If you have copied something word for word, you're going to use quotation marks around that information, copy it word for word, and then immediately beside that information reference where it came from. Paraphrased information is when you take someone else's idea and reword it. So it's still not your idea because you actually got the idea from someone else, it's just you've put it into your own words. In that circumstance, you're not going to use quotation marks, but you do have to reference it. So you still have to tell your reader where you got your information from. But again, you're not going to use quotation marks because you actually put the information in your own words. Summarized information is the same idea. Again, no quotation marks, but you are going to indicate where the information came from. So immediately beside that summary, which is where you take maybe a paragraph and just pull out the main idea, rewrite it into your own words, it's still not your idea, so you still must give credit for where you got it from. Also, statistics need to be referenced. You maybe look at census data, or you look at annual reports and so on, things that are number related. Statistics, you have to tell us where those came from. Also, graphics or images, and this happens a lot in reports or in presentations. If you go online and download an image, maybe a schematic, maybe a pie chart, maybe some sort of a photograph, you need to tell us where that information came from. So basically those 5 circumstances you're going to need to reference, and depending on which referencing style you're using, then it's going to look a little bit different. But both APA and MLA, which I'll talk about momentarily, require you to reference in the text as well as at the end of your document in that detailed listing. So this is what an in-text citation looks like. Whether you've quoted or paraphrased or summarized, you can either mention the piece of information. So if you see that third bulleted point where it says car sales increased by 14% in 2010. So I went online, I looked at the General Motors annual report, and I got that information. Now in brackets, immediately after that information, I need to tell my reader how I know that. I can't make that number up. So in brackets, I indicate the author, General Motors, that's the company. 2011 is the year that I looked at the document, and that information appeared on page 7. So that's called an in-text citation, and that's a way of clearly indicating where you got your information from. Now that happens to be in APA format, and that's one option. You put your information, immediately afterwards you put the brackets around with the author, the year, and the page. Another option, and some people prefer this method, is to mention the author right in your sentence. Then, in the case of APA, you're going to put the year. Then you're going to choose a verb. In this case, I chose concludes. So Hodgins, 2009, concludes, and I didn't actually put the quotation there, but you can see there's quoted material there, and it could be also for paraphrased material, but I put quotation marks around some information, and then at the end of that information I put the page number. So I'm clearly signaling to my reader, this is not my idea. Hodgins, that's the author, 2009, that's the year, concludes, reports, states, indicates, etc. And at the end of that information I put the page number. So that's a way to clearly signal that you're using someone else's idea, or in this case even exact wording, to support your position. The final example there, Sinclair, this is an MLA example. In MLA we don't need to indicate the year in text, so Sinclair's the author. Here's a definition, defines ecology as, and I didn't put the definition down, but I got that information from page 46 in the Sinclair source. So by having these in-text citations, I'm clearly showing my reader who wrote this information, who originally said this information, and if there's a page number, I'm providing a page number. It's a clear signal to my reader that, hey, I'm not trying to steal this information, I'm telling you exactly where it came from. And then, as I mentioned, at the end of your paper, you're going to have that detailed listing at the back that includes the rest of the details, the name of the book, if it's a website, maybe the www, the publisher, and so on. Okay, so APA is very widely used. It's used in the sciences, the health sciences, and the applied sciences. And because of that, because it's the science-related fields, APA is very concerned with how current the research is. So one of the things that sets APA apart from other citation styles is APA requires the year of publication. So as I mentioned before, there are 2 parts to APA. One is what's called the references, and that's otherwise known as a bibliography, but in APA it's called references. That appears at the end of your paper. It's a detailed listing that outlines all of the sources that you referred to. Also those in-text citations, and that's where in the text, in the body of your paper, you're going to have the author, the year, and the page. And they correspond with each other. It's not that you have in-text citations and don't have references. You must have both of them. So the in-text citations provide the author, and then that links us back to the references page, which provides the rest of the details. I'm going to strongly recommend that you pick up a copy if you are responsible for using APA. I'm going to strongly recommend you pick up a copy of the APA Citation Style Guide available from the library, and you'll see that it outlines different examples for referencing. And the guide is divided into sort of two basic halves. First, examples of print material. So if your source happens to be a print material, a book with one author, a book with two authors, a chapter in an edited book, a government document, again, these are print sources, then what you would do is find the example that corresponds with the source you're looking at. So if you are looking at a government document written by, let's say, an individual within the government, we need to know who the author was, the year, the name of the document, the city of publication, and the publisher. Notice that's the references entry. Then for your in-text citation, we need to know the author, corresponds with the reference entry, the year, and when possible, a page number. Okay, this example doesn't have one, but when possible, you want to include the page number. So the references entry and the in-text citation correspond with each other. So print sources, you just have to find the example that corresponds with the print source you're looking at. The other type of source that you might be looking at are electronic sources. This would include websites, journal articles, online newspapers, and so on. So again, the key is just find the type of source, or find the example that matches with the type of source you've got. So if you went to a website and that website happened to have an author, and it could be a company author, it could be a government author, we always want to try and find the author. In APA, we want to know the year. Then, for instance, in a website, the title of the work, so what's at the top of the page, the day you retrieved it, so that's the day that you went online and downloaded it or looked at it, and then the www. So nobody expects you to memorize the rules for APA. Really what you want to do is use the guide available from the library. You can pick it up at the reference desk, or you can look at the electronic version. You want to use the guide available from the library so that you can follow the examples that you'll see in the guide. MLA stands for Modern Language Association, and MLA is used primarily in business, in communications courses, in literature courses, and so on. Where APA uses a references page at the end, the name for that bibliography at the end when you're using MLA is the works cited. It appears at the end of the document, and it corresponds with the in-text citations. The in-text citations for MLA include the author and the page. Remember, I said with APA they're concerned about the year of publication. With MLA, not so much. So we need to know the author and the page number. And the in-text citations match up with the work cited, and the work cited corresponds with the in-text citations. Again, if you're responsible for knowing MLA, I would strongly encourage you to pick up the library guide. You'll see it at the reference desk, and again, it outlines the different examples for referencing different types of sources. So it's got print sources, just like the APA guide, with one author, two authors, and so on. It's got government documents, etc. And then it also has electronic sources, so those would be things like websites, online journals, online dictionaries, and so on. So even referencing images. So the guide is very clearly laid out, and again, you're not expected to memorize the material. What you're expected to do is be able to find the example that corresponds with your source, and then follow the example that you'll see in the guide. In the case of APA and MLA, this guide also shows you what the works cited or references should look like, and it just gives you the format. It shows you that it's double-spaced, that it's organized alphabetically, and it provides examples of what it's supposed to look like. So very clearly laid out, and again, you want to get your hands on a paper copy or at least have the electronic version available so that you can reference things correctly. Some students I know will use electronic citation makers, and I don't generally recommend those. I find that they're not as accurate as a student can be. So if you're carefully recording where your information is coming from, I would trust yourself more than I would trust an electronic citation maker. And using the library guide for either APA or MLA will definitely help you do it accurately. So in order to do your referencing correctly, you need to make sure that you're carefully recording where your information is coming from. Oftentimes, as I said before, you're looking at multiple websites, you're looking at multiple documents. People can access information very quickly from many, many places. So it's important to consistently and accurately keep track of where you're getting your information from. I'm going to show you a research notes form that students find helpful. It helps them to organize their material. So what you'll see, and these are available at SALS, you can come to SALS and pick them up, or you can print them off if you like. For each source that you're looking at, so whether it be a website, a book, a government document, an article from a journal, for each source you're going to include, in this first top box, you're going to include all your referencing information. So if it's in the case of APA, you would need the author, the year, the name of the document, and so on. In the case of MLA, you would need the author, the name of the document, and the year later on. And again, you're not expected to memorize that information or the format. You're expected just to use the guide and apply the format. But going back to the research notes form, what you'll see is a space to put your source information, a space for you to indicate page numbers. So if the source happens to have page numbers, with, in the case of books or journal articles and so on, newspaper articles, you'll see there are page numbers. In the notes section, you're actually going to take your notes. So it could be that you quote the information, and in that case you're going to put quotation marks around the information if you've copied it word for word. Or perhaps you're going to make it into point form notes and later paraphrase or summarize the information. Regardless, you want to put your notes there, and again, in the case of quoted notes, you want to make sure you actually put quotation marks right onto this form. In the plan, this is where you're going to indicate the form of the notes. So for instance, if it is a quotation, you're going to write quotation here. If it's a paraphrase, you're going to write paraphrase. If it's a statistic, write a statistic or definition. The reason for that is you don't want to forget, for instance, that, oh, right, I did reword that. Those are my words, so I don't need to use quotation marks. Or conversely, I have to remind myself that I did quote it exactly, so I want to use quotation marks in the notes section, and I also want to indicate that in my plan. The other part of the plan indicates where you think you might want to use the information. So it could be you want to use it in your introduction, it could be that you want to use it to support one of your points, it could be that you want to use it in the conclusion of your presentation. So this research notes form allows you to record your source information, and then it allows you to keep track of where you're getting your information from. It allows you to keep track of the information itself, and allows you to start thinking about where you might want to use that information. I'm just going to review some top tips for avoiding plagiarism, and you'll notice that towards the end of the presentation there actually is a link for picking up one of our top tips documents at SALS. But this is sort of a highlight of the top 10 points, and hopefully this will be clearer now that you've gone through the material in this workshop. First of all, one way to avoid plagiarism is actually learning what plagiarism is, understanding the definition, understanding the different types of plagiarism, and just getting a clearer sense of what constitutes plagiarism. Another way to avoid plagiarism is to make sure you're clear about what your professor is asking of you. If your professor has said, for instance, do not use Wikipedia, don't use Wikipedia. If your professor has said, do not use long quotations, then don't use long quotations. If your professor has said, use APA citation style, make sure you're using APA citation style. If your professor has said use 3 sources minimum, make sure you're using at least 3 sources. So a way to avoid plagiarism is to make sure you're clear about what's being asked of you in a particular assignment. And if it isn't completely clear, or if you're not completely clear, make sure you go back and get clarification from your professor. Another way to avoid plagiarism is to not procrastinate. So as I mentioned before, when you delay in starting an assignment or save something to the last minute, there's sort of more of a panic situation that happens. You've run out of time, and you might do something that you normally wouldn't do, which would be stealing information or copying from another person. So by not procrastinating, by allowing enough time to complete the work and to submit it on time, and to have a chance actually to look over it for proper referencing and so on, by not procrastinating, you're going to minimize your chances of plagiarizing. Another way to avoid plagiarism is to make sure you're using credible sources. Make sure you're looking at sources that are up to date, that are credible in that we can determine who the author is, that we can determine that it is a reliable source. That's why Wikipedia is generally not considered a credible source. We often don't know who wrote the material, and we also know that people can go in and edit the material. So because it can be changed and because there's no way of tracking who actually did the writing, we wouldn't consider Wikipedia a credible source for the purposes of a college level paper. Another way to avoid plagiarism is to take those research notes. The form that I just showed you allows you to record your source information, and it allows you to record your notes and indicate whether the information is quoted or paraphrased or summarized. It allows you to keep track of your information, to keep yourself organized so that you don't, even by mistake, not reference correctly. Another way to avoid plagiarism is to really be clear about what needs to be referenced. So I mentioned 5 things before. Quoting must be referenced, paraphrased material must be referenced, summarized material, statistics, and images. And if you're not sure, that common knowledge piece, as I said, is a bit of a gray area. If you're not sure whether material needs to be referenced, it's safer to reference it. You can't go wrong referencing. You want to go and find a good quality source and reference that material. Another way to avoid plagiarism is to make sure you're clear about the referencing requirements in your particular field. So for instance, if you're taking psychology, you're going to be using APA, American Psychological Association. They're the people who developed it. If you're taking nursing, then it's going to be APA as well. If you're taking a business course, it's going to be MLA. Make sure you're clear about what's being asked. Your professor will specify which referencing style, and many of those referencing styles or many times referencing is used also in the business world or in the world of work. So learning it in college and being able to understand it and apply it while you're doing your assignments will actually ultimately help you when you're in the workforce as well. And perhaps your boss asks you to write a report or to gather information about a particular topic. Learning how to reference correctly will help to make you a more credible writer. Also, another way to avoid plagiarism is to carefully and clearly integrate the referenced material. So it could be quotations, it could be paraphrased material, making sure that you're clearly signaling where you got your information from by using one of those verbs, by mentioning the author perhaps in your sentence. Smith, 2009, indicates. Jones, 2007, concludes. So by clearly signaling where you got your information from and integrating that researched material into your work, it's going to clearly show your reader where it came from, and then it's going to link back to the references page or the works cited page. Another really key step in avoiding plagiarism is to allow time to review your work. If you don't allow time to review your work, to check for formatting, to check for referencing, to make sure your in-text citations correspond with your works cited or your references page. If you don't allow time to review your work, not to mention the fact that you want to check it for grammar and spelling and punctuation and so on, but if you don't allow time to review your work for referencing, you could miss something. And if you don't catch it, either your professor or Turnitin.com likely will. So you want to make sure that you finish your work in time and allow yourself time to go back and look through your work to make sure you've done things correctly. Also, I would recommend you come and seek academic support. If you are not sure about referencing, you can talk to your professor, and you can also come to SALS and get some assistance with referencing and understanding the requirements for using in-text citations as well as creating the works cited or references page. And speaking of going for help, as I said, you can speak with your professor. Make sure you're clear about the assignment's requirements. Make sure that you use the assignment rubric to go back and double check that you've done everything you were supposed to do, that you've used the right types of sources, that you've referenced correctly, that you've made sure that you have followed the correct format, and so on. I would also recommend that you come to SALS and pick up a copy of Top Tips for Avoiding Plagiarism. I'll just show you what it looks like. You can find them in the SALS office, along with all sorts of other top tips ones. This is the one that I summarized before, and they're available for you to pick up, share with your friends, post wherever you need to make sure that you understand how to stay away from plagiarism. I would also recommend you check out our website, and you can see it there. There's all sorts of writing related resources, learning skills resources, the research notes forums, and so on and so on. And really a wealth of information available on our website, and or you can come into SALS and pick up a lot of the material in paper format. If you still need assistance, then I would recommend you come and see me, the writing specialist, or book an appointment with a peer writing tutor who can help you identify how to do in-text citations and how to correctly format a references page or a works cited page. And if you have English as your second or additional language, then you could see the ESL specialist at SALS who can work with you to help you understand more about plagiarism and help you understand the referencing requirements. So there's lots of help available. You just have to ask for help. Don't try to go it alone. If you're not sure, talk with your professor. Make sure you get that library guide so that you can follow the format consistently. And just keep in mind that it is your responsibility as a college student to understand what plagiarism is, know how to avoid it, and if you do have questions, make sure you speak with someone at the college or your professor, or come to SALS and get clarification. We've got a Facebook account, we've got our Twitter account. You can stay in touch with SALS and all the stuff that we're doing, and if you have any questions, you can contact us at the telephone number or the email you see below. So thanks very much for listening, and hopefully that was helpful. And again, there's lots of help available. Make sure you allow yourself time to properly document your work and understand the responsibilities that you have as a college student.